Former President Donald Trump's recent comments about drug charges and the death penalty has led to some concern.
During an interview at the Economic Club of Chicago on Tuesday, he suggested that convicted drug offenders should receive the death penalty.
Saying it, but I've seen a lot of countries. I deal with all of them, and I know that all of them. And the only ones that don't have a drug problem are the ones that have the death penalty. We can set up all of our blue ribbon committees. Everybody calls me. You would call me. My friends call me. Could I be on that blue ribbon committee? And then have a blue ribbon committee on drugs and how to stop, these drug lords who are very smart people, very, very vicious, very smart. And we'll have these people from New York, some dilettantes, and they don't want to talk about it. They just want to be a part of, whatever it is. The only ones that stop drugs, the only ones, are the ones that have the death penalty. And you have
In a social media post on X, Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel said she believes it's a dangerous precedent.
She also said that she thinks Black and Hispanic men are most likely to be sentenced to death. She stopped by CBS News Detroit to elaborate on her social media post.
How he wants to reimpose the death penalty for drug-related offenses in a way that it has not been traditionally been used. But I think it's important for people to know exactly what that means, right? Now, Donald Trump has said over and over again that he is a significant proponent for the death penalty, and we know that the numbers bear that out. So in the last 60 years or so in the United States, we've only had 16 people that were put to death by the federal government, but 13 of those people were under the Trump administration. In fact, 3 just in his last week of office. So if you're going to extend this to not just cases involving a homicide, but also just straight drug trafficking cases, we're talking about tens of thousands of people each and every year that could be sentenced to death and be put to death by the federal government. Now, right now, there is a United States Supreme Court case that would outlaw that, and that specifically says if there's no homicide involved, you can't issue the death penalty just for a drug-related offense. But we've seen a lot of precedential cases that have been overturned in recent years, and I think that this would be overturned as well.
All right, let's bring in former U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me back.
So there's been a lot of back and forth on social media about these comments and even just the suggestion concerning capital punishment. Let's start with your thoughts on what we're hearing so far.
Well, the first thought to think about is that this concept of having the death penalty for drug dealers and whether or not that should be in federal law, that already is in federal law and has been for decades. So it's already established that if you use a firearm during a drug transaction and you kill someone, or you're using a firearm in a racketeering activity related to drugs or a criminal activity related to drugs, there are already several federal laws that cover that. So what President Trump effectively is saying is already in federal law. What the controversy is whether or not he wants to expand that to make it apply to law situations that are less severe. And that's really the issue here that people are concerned about.
And if he was elected, could he make these changes?
No. And that's another thing to think about, because if you're going to have a federal law mandating the death penalty for a low-level drug offense, the only way you're going to be able to do that is to have the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate pass that law, give it to the president, and have the president sign it. And then, of course, it has to pass the Supreme Court test as well. So the Senate is currently in the hand of the Democratic Party. It doesn't appear that there would be any momentum for this type of law. So it doesn't look like this type of law would be passed as we know it right now.
Any thoughts on the claims brought up by Dana Nessel? There was a study at Washington State that found that some minorities are more than 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death. Any validity there, or any thoughts on how that plays into this conversation?
Certainly, there are a lot of studies like that. And in fact, in Michigan, where I was the U.S. attorney, this is just not a popular issue. The death penalty has been brought in front of juries many times here in this state, and it hasn't been imposed. Michigan has outlawed the death penalty since before Michigan was a state, since it was a territory. I know it's still legally federally here, But the state of Michigan and Michigan juries, they don't have a lot of stomach for the death penalty, and they haven't for a long time. And so whether it's effectively used in this state, it doesn't appear to be that way. It might be more effective in other states, but not in Michigan.
And, it says, obviously you said it really wouldn't pass. Did we get a sense from Trump with that claim, what the case would be, if it would be applied to former cases or new cases? What's the sense there?
Yeah, so he hasn't opined on that. You couldn't apply that to cases in the past that would violate retroactivity laws. Of course, there's a political campaign going on right now. This wouldn't be the first time a presidential candidate has called for the expansion of the death penalty for certain crimes. And I remember when I was in high school seeing George H.W. Bush speak in Saginaw about giving the death penalty to cop killers. That was something he actually campaigned on, and that was an election issue. We're in a campaign right now. We're in election issues that we're seeing. And so this is just another one of those things that are coming up, and we should expect that is talked about on the campaign trail.
With that being said, how would you speak to just the importance of voters doing their own homework and research and kind of knowing how things work? Because people are hearing these things and being very alarmed. And like you mentioned, some of those things are already in place.
Right. So people thinking that President Trump can come into office again and automatically start putting people to death. It's not going to happen because there are federal laws against that. And also, having been involved in federal death penalty cases myself, I can tell you from the time of the person being charged and convicted to the time where you're actually looking at a death row sentence of execution, you're looking at a term of about 10 years. Through all those appeals, all those trials, all those reconsiderations, it takes about a decade to get one of these cases through the system. And if President Trump is reelected, that's only for 4 years. There's ample amount of time for another administration to come in and change their position on the death penalty if it is not the same as the president's.
And just quickly, give us a snapshot of the death penalty nationally, just in general, breaking down which states actually do have it.
So it's more applied. It's more applied in the southern states, Texas, Alabama. Those states typically have the death penalty both in state and federal courts that are utilized more frequently. The northern states, often that doesn't happen. As I indicated, Michigan was the first English-speaking jurisdiction to outlaw it. There have been federal instances of it being attached here, but juries have not rendered the guilty verdict that attaches to the death penalty. So Michigan is really unique in some circumstances because the voters here, when passing the Michigan Constitution in 1964, they decided they were going to enshrine that in the state constitution. And that's just not the case in some other states such as Texas or Alabama.
All right, Mr. Schneider, thank you again for joining us and for giving us the insight that we need on these important topics. We appreciate it.
Thank you.